I remember the exact sound of her laughter. It wasn't a warm laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh that fills a room with joy and makes children smile. No, it was the kind of laugh that is meant to cut. Sharp, pointed, aimed directly at you like a knife you never saw coming. I was sitting at the far end of the dinner table, the same table I had bought with my own hands 31 years ago, from a small furniture shop on Miller Street. The wood was old now, scratched, worn in places, a lot like me. My name is Harold James Whitfield. I am 63 years old. And that night I sat quietly in my chair while my wife, Patricia, told our entire family, our son, our daughter-in-law, my brother-in-law Gerald, his wife Donna, and their 2 adult children, that I was a failure, not in those exact words. Patricia was always clever. She never used one sharp word when she could use 10 soft ones that landed just as hard. "Oh, Harold wouldn't know anything about that," she said, waving her hand in my direction like she was swatting a fly. "He never really understood how money works." Everyone laughed. My son, Daniel, looked down at his plate. My daughter-in-law, Renee, smiled into her wine glass, and I said nothing. I picked up my fork. I took a bite of the roast potato. I chewed slowly, and I said absolutely nothing, because that was who I was. Harold Whitfield, the quiet one, the patient one, the man who had worked 2 jobs for 11 years to put a roof over his family's head, and had never once asked for applause. But here is the thing about silence. Sometimes silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is simply a man waiting for the truth to speak for itself. And that night, that ordinary Sunday dinner in October, the truth finally arrived. It arrived in the form of a single buzz from Patricia's phone. And when she looked down at that screen, the smile died on her face so fast that the whole room felt it. The laughter stopped, the forks went still, and the truth, 31 years of it, sat down at that table like an uninvited guest who had every right to be there. Stay with me, because what happened next I never could have predicted. Not in 1,000 years. Let me take you back. Not to the dinner. Not yet. Let me take you back to where this story really begins, because you cannot understand what happened that night without understanding the man who sat at the end of that table. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio. My father was a factory worker. My mother cleaned houses on weekdays and ironed other people's shirts on weekends. We were not poor in spirit, but we were poor in everything else. I wore the same 2 pairs of trousers to school for 3 years. I never once complained. When I was 19, I got my first job at a printing press. Loud, hot, physical work. My hands bled for the first 2 months, but I showed up every single day. I showed up when I was 20, for I met Patricia. She was beautiful, confident. She had a laugh that lit up the whole room back then, a real laugh, genuine, full of life. I fell for her so fast it felt like falling off a cliff, and I wanted nothing more than to build something real with her. We got married in June of 1993. Small ceremony, 30 people in a church hall. I wore a borrowed suit. She wore a dress her mother had sewn by hand. I promised her that day that I would take care of her, and I meant every word. What I did not know, what no young man in love ever knows, is that the person you marry at 24 is not always the person they will become at 54. People change, and sometimes they change in directions that leave you behind. For the first 10 years, we were okay. Not perfect, not wealthy, but okay. I worked at the printing press during the day and drove a delivery truck 3 nights a week. Patricia stayed home with Daniel when he was small. She cooked. She kept the house. She seemed content enough. Daniel was the light of my life. From the day that boy was born, I would have walked through fire for him. I used to carry him on my shoulders to the park on Sunday mornings. I taught him to ride a bike in the parking lot of the old grocery store. I helped him with his homework every night at this very kitchen table, the one we would later sit at, while his mother told everyone I was a failure. But somewhere along the way, I think it was around the time Daniel went to high school, Patricia started to change. She started watching her sister's life more closely. Her sister, Carol, had married a man named Vincent who worked in finance. They had a bigger house, newer cars. They went to restaurants where the menus had no prices listed. And Patricia began to measure our life against theirs. Vincent just bought Carol a new car, she would say, not looking at me, pretending to fold laundry. "That's nice," I would say. "He's taking her to Bermuda in the spring. Good for them." And she would go quiet. But not the kind of quiet that meant she was at peace. The kind of quiet that meant she was keeping score. I tried. Lord knows I tried. I picked up more hours. I got my commercial driver's license so I could take longer routes and earn more. When the printing press downsized and I lost my main job, I retrained at 51 years old and got certified in building maintenance. I was not too proud to learn new things. I was not too proud to wear overalls when I had once worn a collar and tie. But to Patricia, and eventually to the rest of the family, none of that counted for much, because the house was not as big as Carol's house, because the car was 8 years old, because Harold Whitfield had never figured out how to be impressive. The Sunday dinners started about 5 years ago, after Daniel married Renee. Renee was a nice enough young woman. Smart, well-dressed. She came from a family with more money than ours, and she never let you forget it, not loudly, not rudely, but in small, quiet ways. The way she looked around our kitchen the first time she visited. The way she always brought expensive wine to dinners, as if she assumed we wouldn't have anything suitable. Daniel adored her, and because Daniel adored her, I adored her too, or I tried to. The Sunday dinners were Patricia's idea, a chance for the whole family to come together, and in the beginning they were fine, ordinary. We ate, we talked, we laughed. But gradually, so gradually I almost didn't notice, the dinners became something else. They became a stage, and I became the punchline. It started small, a comment here, a raised eyebrow there. Harold spent all day trying to fix that drain, Patricia would say. Took him 4 hours. A plumber would have done it in 20 minutes. Light laughter around the table. Then it grew. "You know Harold turned down that job offer last year, said the commute was too far. Can you imagine?" More laughter. Daniel looking at his plate, then bigger still. "I don't know how we've managed, honestly. Harold's never really had what you'd call a head for finances." Gerald nodding. Donna making that sympathetic face she had perfected. Renee glancing at Daniel with that look. And every single time, I said nothing. I sat at the end of that table with my hands folded, and I let it wash over me, because what could I say? Shout, argue, prove myself with a list of everything I had sacrificed. That is not who I am. I was raised to believe that a man's actions speak for him. I believed that quietly, patiently, the truth would be known. But here is what nobody tells you about being the quiet man in the room. When you stay silent, people assume they are right, and so the cruelty grew, dinner by dinner, because I never pushed back. I became the family's safe target, the man you could laugh at without consequence, because Harold would never make a scene. Harold would never fight back. Harold would just sit there and take it with that patient, sad look on his face. I want to stop here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room full of people who are supposed to love you and felt completely alone? That was every Sunday dinner for me for 5 years, until the night everything changed. It was the 14th of October. I remember because it was 3 days after my 63rd birthday. Nobody at that dinner had mentioned my birthday. Not Patricia, not Daniel, not one of them. I had spent my birthday alone, Patricia had gone to her sister Carol's house to help plan some event. She had come home late, smelling of Carol's expensive perfume, and gone straight to bed without a word. I had sat in the living room that night with a cup of tea and the television on low, and I had thought to myself, very quietly, very calmly, this cannot go on forever. But I said nothing. I never said anything. 3 days later, Sunday dinner, Gerald and Donna arrived first, as they always did. Their son Marcus, who worked in real estate and wore shirts that cost more than my weekly grocery bill, came in behind them, shaking hands with everyone like he was arriving at a business meeting. Daniel and Renee arrived 20 minutes late. Renee had a new handbag. She put it on the kitchen counter where everyone could see it. I had cooked the dinner. I want you to know that. Patricia had a headache. She often had a headache on Sunday mornings, and so I had spent 3 hours cooking. A roast chicken, roasted potatoes, green beans, homemade gravy, fresh bread rolls. Nobody commented on the food except to eat it. We sat down. Conversation began, and within 15 minutes it started. Harold, Marcus was telling us about his new investment property. Gerald said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied look of a man who has already decided how the conversation will go. You ever think about getting into property? I've thought about a lot of things. I said, of course, it takes capital. Marcus added, smiling at his own plate. You need a foundation to build from. Patricia laughed softly. Harold's foundation is that truck he drives. More laughter. Light, easy, practiced. I cut my chicken. Oh, don't be cruel, Patricia, said Donna, but she was smiling when she said it, which meant she didn't mean a word of it. I'm not being cruel, I'm being honest. Patricia said, Harold's always been more comfortable with simple work. There's nothing wrong with it. She said there's nothing wrong with it, the way people say bless your heart, meaning the exact opposite. Daniel looked at me, just briefly, and I truly thought, that he might say something, that my son, my boy, the one I had carried on my shoulders and taught to ride a bike, might speak up. But he looked back down at his plate, and that moment was the one that hurt the most. Not Patricia's words. Daniel's silence, the conversation moved on. Gerald started talking about a cruise he and Donna were planning. Marcus mentioned a golf trip. Renee talked about renovating their kitchen. And then Patricia said it. The thing that she said that night that I will never forget for as long as I live. She was laughing about something. I had stopped listening, and then she turned to Donna and said, with that warm, comfortable smile, honestly, Donna, sometimes I look at my life and I think, how did I end up here? I had so much potential. I could have done so much more. But when you marry someone who can't keep up with you, she trailed off, shaking her head, still smiling. The table went quiet for just a moment, a polite quiet, an uncomfortable quiet. And then, before anyone could speak, before I could swallow the stone that had formed in my throat, Patricia's phone buzzed. She glanced down, reflex, the way everyone does, and the smile vanished, just like that, gone. Her face went white, then pink, then something I had never seen on Patricia's face in 31 years of marriage, fear. Patricia didn't answer. She was staring at her phone like she was reading something she could not believe. Patricia, Gerald said. She put the phone face down on the table, looked up, tried to smile. Fine, just nothing. It's nothing. But her hands were shaking. I watched her. I said nothing. I picked up my glass of water, and I took a slow sip, and then her phone buzzed again. And again, she picked it up, read. Her lips pressed together so tightly they went white. I just need to excuse me for a moment. She pushed back her chair and walked quickly out of the dining room toward the hallway. The table sat in silence for a moment. She okay? Marcus asked, looking at me. I'm sure she's fine, I said. We heard her voice in the hallway. Low, urgent. She was talking to someone. We couldn't make out the words, but we could hear the tone, tight, strained. the voice of someone trying very hard not to panic. She came back to the table 5 minutes later. She sat down. She did not pick up her fork. She looked at me across the length of the table, and for the first time in a very long time, she looked unsure. "Harold," she said, "can I talk to you, privately, after dinner?" "Of course," I said, and I returned to my meal. But here is the thing I have never told anyone until now. I already knew what that phone call was about. I had known for 6 weeks. 6 weeks before that dinner, on a Wednesday morning in early September, I had received a phone call from a man named Robert Kane. He was a solicitor, a lawyer, handling the estate of my Uncle Theodore. Uncle Theodore. I hadn't spoken his name in years. He was my father's older brother, a quiet, private man who had never married, never had children. He had worked as an engineer for 40 years, lived simply, invested carefully, and died at age 80. Ate in a house outside of Portland, Oregon. I had visited him 3 times in my adult life. We wrote letters occasionally, real letters, on paper. He was the kind of man who appreciated that. The last letter I received from him was 4 months before he passed. He had written, "Harold, you are the most decent man I know. Your father would be proud. I hope you know your own worth, even when others don't see it." I had read that letter alone in my truck on my lunch break, and I had cried, quietly, by myself, as I did most things. Robert Kane told me on that Wednesday morning in September that Uncle Theodore had left me everything. His house, his investments, his savings, the total value of the estate, after legal fees and taxes, came to just over $1.4 million. $1.4 million. I sat in my truck for 40 minutes after that phone call. I didn't move. I just sat there, watching the pigeons walk around the parking lot, thinking about a letter written on paper by an old man who had seen something in me that the people under my own roof could not. I called Robert Kane back. I asked him what I needed to do. He told me. I listened carefully. And then, and this is the part that some people might not understand, I decided to say nothing. Not to Patricia, not to Daniel, not to anyone. I decided to wait. I don't know exactly why. Maybe some part of me needed to see, needed to know with complete certainty, whether the people in my life loved Harold Whitfield, the delivery driver and maintenance man, or whether they only had room for whoever Harold Whitfield might become. I think part of me already knew the answer, but I needed to sit at that table one more Sunday. I needed to hear it one more time, and I did. How did I end up here? I had so much potential. But when you marry someone who can't keep up with you, those were the last words my wife ever spoke about me that way. Because the phone buzzed. Part 7. What was on the phone? What had Patricia seen on that phone that drained the color from her face? Robert Kane. He had sent Patricia a message. She was still my legal spouse, and the estate finalization required her signature on one document. His message informed her that the paperwork for the Whitfield inheritance transfer was ready, and that the final disbursement of $1.4 million to my personal account would be processed by end of week. He had attached a brief summary document. Patricia had read it at the dinner table, in front of her whole family, in the middle of calling me a man she had wasted her potential on. After I finished eating, I helped clear the plates. I thanked Donna for bringing the dessert. I said good night to Gerald and Marcus with a handshake. I was perfectly calm, perfectly ordinary. Daniel stopped me on the way back from the kitchen. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice was different. Something in it I hadn't heard in a while, something young. "Dad, he stopped. "It's all right, son." I said. "No," he said. "It's not. It hasn't been all right for a while, and I should have." His voice broke just slightly, and he stopped again, pressing his lips together. I put my hand on his shoulder. We'll talk, I said. Not tonight, but we'll talk. He nodded. He looked like a boy again, not a grown man. For just a second, he looked like the boy in the parking lot, learning to ride a bike. I found Patricia in the kitchen after everyone else had gone. She was standing at the counter with her arms folded around herself, her phone up beside her. She had been crying. Her mascara had run slightly at the corners of her eyes. I stood in the doorway. She looked at me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "Harold, I had no idea." "I know," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at her. This woman I had loved for 31 years. This woman who had laughed at me at my own table. I looked at her, and I thought about every Sunday dinner, every quiet moment of humiliation, every time Daniel had looked at his plate. "I didn't tell you," I said slowly, "because I needed to know something." "What did you need to know?" "Whether you respected me before." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. She opened her mouth. "Closed it, Patricia." I said, "I've driven that truck in rain and snow and 40-degree heat. I have worked maintenance jobs that left my knees aching so badly I couldn't climb the stairs without holding the rail. I have never, not once, asked you to thank me for it. I never asked for a parade. I never asked for applause. All I ever needed was to be treated like a man who was trying his best. Harold." "At my own dinner table," I said, and my voice was steady. "At a table I bought with my own money, in a house I paid for with those same hands you find so embarrassing. You told your family that you wasted your potential on me. I didn't mean." "Patricia," I stopped her gently, "you meant every word, and that's all right, because at least now we both know exactly where we stand." I walked past her into the living room. I sat in my chair. I turned on the television, low, and I let her stand in the kitchen for a while with all of it. I will not pretend that what came next was easy or clean. None of it was. Patricia did not sleep that night. I heard her moving around the house at 2 in the morning, at 4, at 5:30. I heard her sitting at the kitchen table. I heard her crying once softly through the wall. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. I was not happy. Let me be clear about that. There was no satisfaction in it for me. There was only sadness. The deep, honest sadness of a man who has finally accepted something he had been avoiding for a very long time. My marriage was not what I had believed it was. Or perhaps it had been once. Perhaps we had simply grown in different directions so slowly that neither of us had noticed until we were standing at opposite ends of the same room, too far apart to hear each other clearly. The next morning, I made coffee. Patricia came downstairs around 7. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, this old scratched table that had witnessed everything. She looked terrible. She looked old. Not in a cruel way, in a human way. In a real way. She looked like a woman who had spent the night taking stock of herself and had not liked what she found. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Yes," I said, "a real one. Not just Harold, I am so sorry. Not just for last night, for a long time." I looked at her. "I have been unkind to you," she said, "for years, and I told myself it was just venting, just teasing, just I don't know. But it wasn't. It was unkind, and you never deserved it. You have never deserved it." She was crying again. Quietly, with her hands folded on the table, I thought about what to say. I turned my coffee mug slowly in my hands. "Patricia," I said finally, "the money doesn't change who I was before the phone call. I was the same man at that dinner table that I've always been. The same man you've been embarrassed by for years. The money didn't make me worth more. I was always worth exactly what I was." She closed her eyes. "The question," I said, "is whether you can see that now. Not because of what's in my bank account, but because of who I actually am." She didn't have an answer for me that morning. And honestly, I wasn't sure I needed one right then. My son called me 2 days later. He asked if he could come over, just the two of us. I said yes. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping well either. We sat in the living room. He didn't speak for a while. He just sat there looking at his hands. Dad, he said finally, I need to say something, and I need you to let me say the whole thing. Go ahead, son. I've been a coward, he said. For years, I sat at those dinners and I listened to Mom say those things about you, and I never once said anything. I told myself it was easier. I told myself it was just her way. But the truth is, I was just being a coward. I didn't want to make things uncomfortable. And you were my father. You were sitting right there, and I let her treat you that way, and I am so ashamed of myself. His voice broke on the last word. Daniel, I said. I'm serious, Dad. The times you helped me when I was in college and ran out of money, and you sent that check without me even asking. When Renee and I had that problem with the car and you drove 4 hours in the middle of the night to help us. You have never, not once, let me down. And I sat there, and I let her call you a failure. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Son, I said. I leaned forward. I put my hand on his knee. Look at me. He looked up. You're my son, I said. You have made mistakes. You are going to make more mistakes. That is being human. What matters is that you're here now. What matters is that you know it was wrong. What matters is what you do from this point forward. He nodded. His jaw was tight. But I need you to hear this, I said. Not just for me, for yourself, for your own family someday, if you have children. Silence in the face of cruelty, even small cruelty, even quiet cruelty, is a choice. It always is. And you're going to have to make that choice over and over again in your life. I hope you make a better one than you did at that table. He nodded again. He reached out and shook my hand, the handshake of a man, not a boy. And then he pulled me into a hug. And I held my son for a long moment in the living room of the house I had paid for, at the age of 63, thinking about the boy in the parking lot with his little hands on the handlebars. I hired a financial advisor named Gregory Parks, a calm, precise man who walked me through everything with patience and clarity. Together we made decisions, careful, considered ones. I bought a small house, just for myself, a modest, peaceful place on a quiet street with a garden I could tend. Nothing excessive, nothing showy, just a home that was mine. I set up a college fund for Daniel and Renee's children, if they ever had them. Not because I owed it to anyone, because I wanted to. I made a donation to the elementary school in the town where I grew up, in my father's name. He never got the recognition he deserved either. And I wrote a letter to Uncle Theodore, not because he could read it, but because I needed to say the words. I wrote, Theodore, you saw me clearly when others could not. I hope I lived up to what you saw. I am going to try to live up to it now. I promise. I folded that letter and put it in the drawer of my bedside table in the new house. Patricia and I, we are working through things. Slowly, carefully, honestly. I will not tell you it is easy. I will not tell you it is resolved. 31 years of a marriage is not a simple thing to examine and repair. Some days I look at her, and I see the woman in the borrowed dress in the church hall in June of 1993. Other days I remember October 14th. Both of those things are true. Both of them live in me. What I can tell you is that she is trying, genuinely trying, and I have chosen, for now, to watch and to wait, not with bitterness, but with an open heart and honest eyes. Because that is who Harold Whitfield is, and no amount of laughter at any dinner table ever changed that. I did not expect to hear from Gerald. Gerald had never been a bad man. He was just a man who went along with the current, who laughed when everyone else laughed without thinking too hard about the cost. Most people are like that. It is not a virtue, but it is not entirely a sin either. He called me on a Friday evening, about 2 weeks after the dinner. His voice was gruff and uncomfortable, the way men's voices get when they're about to do something unfamiliar. Harold, he said, Gerald, He stopped, cleared his throat. Donna made me call. I know, I said. She said I should apologize. And she's right. He paused. I'm sorry, Harold, for sitting there and laughing along and never saying a word in your defense. You've always been a decent man, and I treated you like you weren't in the room. I was quiet for a moment. Gerald, I said, the apology means something, thank you. He exhaled a long, heavy breath. You know, my father was a lot like you. Quiet man, hard worker. We never appreciated him enough either. He stopped. Funny how you only see certain things clearly when it's almost too late. Almost, I said. That word is doing a lot of work. He actually laughed at that. A real laugh, surprised out of him. Almost, he agreed. 3 months after October 14th, we had another Sunday dinner. Patricia organized it. She told me she wanted things to be different. She asked if I would come. I went. I sat at the end of the table again. Same chair, same scratched table, same kitchen, but the room felt different. Gerald was there. He helped me carry the food from the kitchen without being asked. Marcus, who had always treated me with polite indifference, asked me, genuinely, about my uncle. About what he had been like. I told him about the letters, about the man who had lived quietly and given everything away to the nephew he had believed in. Marcus listened, really listened, without his phone, without checking his watch. Daniel sat next to me. He passed me the bread before anyone else. Small thing, deliberate. Renee made a comment early in the dinner, nothing cruel, just a passing remark about how she had heard about the inheritance, and wasn't it wonderful? And Patricia looked at her steadily and said, Harold's always been wonderful. We just weren't always wise enough to say so. The table was quiet for a moment. Then Donna said, Hear, hear, and she raised her glass, and they all raised their glasses to me. Harold James Whitfield, 60, 3 years old, driver and maintenance man and quiet man, and it turned out, the person in that room who had always had the most, not money. I don't mean money, I mean dignity. I mean self-knowledge. I mean the kind of peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are, regardless of whether anyone else can see it. I raised my glass back. I looked around that table at these flawed, complicated, familiar people who were my family, and I said the only thing there was to say, thank you. Now let's eat before it gets cold. And everyone laughed. This time, I laughed too. I am not telling you this story to make you hate Patricia, or to make you celebrate my inheritance. That is not the point. The point is something much simpler. There is a man in your life, maybe a father, a husband, a brother, an uncle, who wakes up every morning and goes to work and comes home tired and sits quietly at the table and never asks for anything. He doesn't drive a fancy car. He doesn't say impressive things at dinner parties. He doesn't have a title or a trophy on the mantelpiece. And because he is quiet, because he doesn't demand to be seen, you have perhaps begun to look through him. You have perhaps begun to measure his worth in the wrong currency. Let me tell you something I have learned in 63 years on this earth. The loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest, and the richest person in the room is rarely the wealthiest, and the person who laughs the most comfortably at someone else's expense is almost always the most afraid. The quiet man at the end of the table, the one you think has nothing to offer, may be carrying more grace, more dignity, and more love in his chest than everyone else at that table combined. See him, before the phone buzzes, before the letter arrives, before it is too late, and all you have left is the echo of your own laughter in an empty room. See him now, while you still can, because respect is not something you give a person after you discover their bank balance. Respect is something you owe every human being who has ever gotten up in the morning and tried. And if you have someone in your life that you have not been seeing clearly, call them today, not tomorrow, today. Tell them you see them. Tell them you're sorry. Tell them they matter, before the only thing left to tell them is that you wish you had. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you might have been overlooking, please share it. You never know who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Every week we bring you stories about real life, real love, and the quiet truths that change everything. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because the next story might be the one that changes your life.